Hello, and welcome to Chapter 13, Conflict and Stress. We just finished Power, Politics, and Ethics, and power was the capacity to influence someone. Politics was the flow of that power, and conflict can be when that power and flow of power has been resisted. So here's what we know about conflict and stress. On the next two slides, we have 5 factors that contribute to organizational conflict. And the first 2 are shown here: group identification and intergroup bias and interdependence. So the first one, group identification and intergroup bias, that's a basic function of groups from social psychology, that people identify very strongly with their group and see it's us versus them. And here it's called the in-group and the out-group. So it's just a standard factor that leads to conflict, because the more we divide the world into us and them, then the more we have the predisposition to conflict between us and them. And then interdependence. The opposite of that, of course, is when you're not dependent on each other. When you're separated, you're buffered, then there's less chance for conflict. But the more you're interdependent with a person or a department with another department, then the more likely there's going to be the potential for conflict between them. Here are the other 3 factors. The first is differences in power, status, and culture. So if we have 2 people or 2 groups that have differential power, then one of those persons or groups can kind of try to force the other group to do something, and the other group may resist, and so then you have the conflict. Differences in status. The less 2 people or teams, groups are equal, then the more likely that one of them is going to try to influence the other more than the other wants to be influenced, and therefore they're going to fight back a bit. So that's the potential for conflict. And culture, when subgroups have different cultures, so subcultures in organizations, the more they are interdependent again, they're likely to have conflict. So different cultures, different values, beliefs, different ways of doing things can lead to that possibility of conflict. Ambiguity. When you're not sure how things are supposed to be done, when it's not clear, when it's not orderly, well, then people and the people in larger groups and departments are going to have some fighting between them over how should we do something. When it's all been figured out and decided and it becomes routinized, well, then less potential for conflict, because everyone agrees there is a best way. And scarce resources. Resources, I think by definition, are pretty much always scarce, and people want more. More is usually seen as better, and departments usually want more. And so they're going to fight to get that more, and more resources means more power. More power means more potential influence, which can lead to more conflict. 3 types of conflict here between people. People don't get along, personality clashes. The task, what should we be doing? And then process, how should we be doing it? It's just like basic things that we can find disagreements on within organizations. Now it says at the bottom, some degree of task conflict might be beneficial, and I think that's definitely true. What should we be doing? It's not easily defined, actually. Some executives or managers usually have to say this is what our organization should be doing. And they, of course, can make mistakes, or the environment can change, and other people in the organization can say, it's not right. What we're doing is not the right thing, or the environment has changed so that we need to change too. And so productive conflict would be a change in what task are we doing to better fit what's required for success. I mean, some relationship conflict might be, I think that would be okay too, especially when, it's aimed at being productive in resolving problems in how people interact with each other. You can't just let people act, the way they want to if it's not appropriate for the culture, the group norms of the organization. So some conflict, I think, is normal and necessary. And process conflict, I would say also. I mean, you have to conflict over how we do things, and there is always going to be, I think, a better way that will emerge over time. And we're going to see more of this in the chapter on change. Total quality management has this idea of continuous improvement. It's a philosophy that there's a better way. And so that can mean no conflict and that we're always agreed we're going to search for that better way, or it might mean some process conflict over how to find that better way and what it is, what are the steps along the way. I think this is a very important exhibit. It's from Dunet's Handbook, which is a fairly famous book in organizational behavior, 1992. And it gives us 5 approaches that people might take to managing organizational conflict. So you can see them there. And they're on 2 dimensions. The y-axis is attempting to satisfy yourself, your own concerns. And it's labeled as being unassertive at the bottom or the low point of the 0 point of the x-axis, and assertive on the upper end. And the other axis is cooperativeness, the extent to which you're attempting to and are willing to satisfy the other party's concerns. And it goes on the x, did I get my axes wrong? On the x-axis from uncooperative to cooperative. Okay, so there they are. And the compromise one in the middle is a mix of the other 4. So the 4 that are pure types, ideal types, are avoiding, competing, collaborating, and accommodating. And the first thing I'd like to have you think about for yourself, and you can pause when I've given you the question, is if you had a default style. So there's some kind of conflict. And it doesn't have to be at work. It could be anywhere in your life. There's some situation where there's some potential for conflict. A roommate is coming in late and making a lot of noise and waking you up, and you have an early shift at work, an early class, something like that. You have a baby that's sleeping. So there's a potential for conflict here. What's your default? Your go-to strategy. And I think that can help you to understand how you personally approach conflict. Because it may be the same in your regular outside of work life and your work life, that this is just a personal thing. And it's good to know what yours is. So the next 3 slides will describe each of these styles in more detail. And we're also going to look at when you should use each, when each is recommended. So a person who, if you're an avoiding type person, so that's unassertive, meaning you don't say what you want, but you're also uncooperative. You don't want the other person to get what they want. You just don't want to deal with this. That is a style that's recommended in some cases, but not in all cases. So that's just the one example. We'll look at the styles and when to use them. When should you compete? Well, it says here, when you have a lot of power, you're sure you're right. It is win-lose. So go for it. Go for the win. Sometimes you have to compete, and sometimes you want to win. So, yeah, win. Or you don't think you have to interact with this person in the future. You're not interested in goodwill. This is a one-time thing, and you feel like it's a win or lose, and so I might as well win. I would say you never quite know when you're going to deal with this person or their friends in the future at work, because, people will talk if they feel the competition that you've taken has not been fair, they've been offended in some way, that it might come back. You might hear about it. It might haunt you in some way. I would say the other reason to compete is when someone at work takes competing as their default style. There are people who take the approach of there's some issue at work. Who gets the break, the break that everyone wants, that it's the right time for lunch or coffee, and maybe they're staggered breaks. And they say, I have to have that break. I have to have 12 noon for my lunch. Like there's no discussion here. And maybe they make up things. I have a medical reason. I can't talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. Maybe they don't say anything. They just sort of stonewall, and they say, I have to have this. And someone else says, well, I have to have it. Well, I'm not interested in your reasons. I will be taking the break at noon. And they're competing. And for some people, their default strategy is competing because they find that's a good way to get what they want. And so I would say you have to compete against those people simply to engage with them. And some of them will respect you more because it's like, well, this is fun. They want to compete. And to them, this is a good time. And it's the only way you'll ever split, the series of wins and losses with them is to compete with them. Otherwise, they win every time. And then compromise. We have one more collaborating coming up next, but compromise. When should you compromise? When, I think the last bullet point, when other strategies aren't working, find a way for each party to get something that they want and not everything they want. And it's been said in negotiation that if both sides walk away feeling a little bit unhappy, that's good. That's a good result. Because if one side walks away happy, that means they got more than they thought they would get from that conflict situation, that negotiation, and therefore the other party lost. They may not know they lost, but They might know it. They might feel unhappy. They might find out later that they lost. So I think compromise is reasonable when you have the situation where you have to satisfy both parties somewhat. Collaborating, the win-win solution, that's the one we always want. That's the one a textbook would normally say, this is what you're after. Find a way to make it so that both sides can get what they want. Find an integrative solution. Find a way to satisfy both sides in this agreement they're reaching so they both feel they won. They're not both unhappy. They're both happy that we found a way to make the pie bigger, to come up with some unique approach that gave each side a good feeling about this. So that's nice when you can find a way to do that. Just don't overstate that that's always going to be the way that you're going to approach conflict. I think these 5 styles, I asked you at the start to think to yourself, what's your default? Because I think people have a default. This isn't in the textbook. And what the book is going to say is that these 5 styles are all useful in certain situations. We covered that. And you need to learn how to exhibit each of these styles when you think it's the right time. So you have to be able to do all of these. So sometimes you have to compete. I made that argument. Sometimes you want to avoid. Sometimes you want the other person to win, and it's more important to them. Sometimes you have to win. This is crucial. This is central to your department, your job. You've got to win this one, so you're competing. Sometimes you collaborate. That's always I think that's the place you start a negotiation. Can we talk to each other? Can we explore? Can we find a way to both win? And if you develop trust over time, or you have trust with the other, then you can share a lot of information and you can more likely find these collaborative solutions. Or do we have to compromise, where neither of us is really happy, but it's better than the other choices that aren't collaborating? So you need to be good at all 5 of these, and you need to be good at reading situations and deciding which to use so that you can exhibit that full range of conflict behavior and do better overall with all the decisions and conflicts that you're in. Well, here's what the textbook has to say about tactics for distributive negotiation. Threats and promises, firmness versus concessions, and persuasion. I think you should read this. I think you should look at other sources, books on negotiation. I think it's worthy of your effort because I think it's important at work. Promises, in the milk situation, the manager could say, well, you're going to buy this tonight, but what if you change your mind tomorrow and you come back and the milk's no good? And the person could promise, well, I won't do that. I guarantee you that I won't come back with this milk. I don't Union management negotiations, I think there's probably threats and promises. the union side would be, we're going to threaten to walk out if we don't get this new contract that has these provisions, walk out, strike, and the management can threaten to lock out. And we've seen that in lots of union management situations. The National Hockey League has had definitely lockouts. I'm not sure if they've had a strike where the players refused to participate. The NFL had a strike where they had replacement players come in. The owners did. Firmness versus concessions. The idea that you start firm on, at the bottom of your settlement range, and you gradually make concessions and move up, and maybe it's down in your range where you're getting less than your optimal, and they do the same, hopefully, on the other side of the negotiation, and gradually you meet somewhere in the middle of that range. And persuasion. There's a TV show called Pawn Stars, set in Las Vegas, and these people own a pawn shop. And, it's fun because it's a lot of it's about history, and some person comes in, with a telescope, and they're like, and the owner of the shop says, "What you got there?" And the person says, "I got a telescope. What you want to do with it?" "I want to sell it." Okay, so they start looking at it. "So tell me about the telescope." And so this is the start of persuasion. Well, this telescope was owned by Galileo himself. "Really? Can you prove that?" says the owner. And they're going back and forth. Well, this is why I think this telescope is valuable. It's got these markings on it. You can see, that it's the metal is from that time period. And the owner is saying, well, I believe it's a telescope, but I don't believe it was owned by Galileo. Like, we have no proof of that. And they're going back and forth, and maybe an expert gets called in to add information. So each party knows the other is self-interested. It helps to introduce some unbiased parties. That's the expert who comes in and looks at the telescope and says, "Wow, I can tell that this telescope was made," and, names the time period and the place, and either it's a fake or it's real, or, goes like that. And then the expert usually gives, here's what I think it's worth. And then the negotiation starts again. And sometimes it's worth more than the owner thinks it was. And sometimes it's worth much less. And often they come to an agreement what the person will sell. And the owner of the pawn shop quite often says, "I agree, it's a very valuable telescope, and you want $50,000 for it." And the expert has said it's worth $50,000. Okay, so I agree, that's what it's worth. But that's what I can sell it for. And it will take me a while to sell this telescope, because how many people want to walk in and buy a telescope for $50,000? There are people out there, but there aren't many of them. So it's going to sit here in the shop for some time. And there's a cost of me owning it and not selling it. So I'll give you $30,000. How's that? Do we have a deal? And the person says, "Oh, 30, oh." And I couldn't possibly sell it for 30. The expert said it's worth 50. It's one of a kind. You'll never see this again. So, and it'll be good for your shop to put in the window, and people can see you have this rare telescope. So I'll go 40. And they often go back and forth like this. And sometimes it's like, we don't have a deal, we can't agree, and they walk away. And sometimes they do have a deal. But you see these strategies being employed. If you ever get a chance to watch Pawn Stars on TV, watch it for the negotiation. And because they do several of these through the show. And one thing that's important is that the owners of the pawn shop, they do this all day, every day for years. So they get quite good at it. Whereas the person walking in, this might be the very first time they've done something like this. It's a skill. It's a skill that you can get better at with reading and studying and training and practice. Well, here's the important one, right? Salary. And what they're saying to you in this textbook, which I have to agree with, is that salary negotiation is important and you should do it. And there's some evidence that men are better at negotiating this outcome than women are. And some people say this might explain some of the differential wages that women make in organizations, the starting salaries, for people of equivalent experience and education. That in this example, a man might negotiate harder or at all and have a higher starting salary. And that, of course, when pay raises are percentages, if each gets 5% a year pay raise and one starts at a higher number, well, of course, that difference grows over time. So the last bullet point, some studies showed that new hires who negotiated earned as much as, or on average, $5,000 more. So they're just trying to say it can be significant. But not everyone wants to do it, and not everyone can do it. And we're trying to encourage you to consider doing this. And if you can't do it yourself, perhaps you need some help. Now, athletes, professional athletes, can hire an agent who does the negotiating. And I'm not sure about joining an organization, how that works. If you can have a lawyer with you and let your lawyer negotiate your salary. I've never heard of that. I'm just sort of imagining how it might work. When you're not negotiating for yourself, it's easier. And that's the second bullet point. The difference between men and women is less when women either have learned to negotiate or are negotiating for someone else. Because it's not personal and they don't feel embarrassed and, I hate to have to ask. And so maybe you can find a way to have someone negotiate in some way for you. I've seen some salary negotiations where a professor, for example, is a desirable commodity, has lots of publications, and schools want this person. And a school will call a professor working at another university and say, we want you to join us. What will it take? And so the professor names some conditions, some salary, and the school who wants the professor might say, yeah, we can do that. So we have a deal, right? We'll send you the contract. And they say, write it up. So they write up the deal, and you're always supposed to get it in writing, which I find difficult to do. But that's what you're supposed to do, get the offer in writing. That makes it legal and official. And what some people do, and we'll not talk about the ethics of this, but what some people do is take that offer to their own organization and say, I've been offered this out there in the world. Are you willing to match it? And I've heard of that being successful. But it's a dangerous game, because if your boss says, well, congratulations, good luck, we hate to lose you, when's your last day? It can be awkward, I would think. So I can't remember where it was going to go. I did want to say on that last slide that I remembered a story about a professor who was telling me one time that he was offered this job at a university, and it was what was called a low ball offer. So meaning it was extremely low for this person's qualifications, and the university that made the offer did not expect it to be accepted. And organizations will do this sometimes because they have to prove to some committee or outsiders that other offers were made. They might have a preferred candidate kind of in mind, but they interview others. They even make offers to these others, but they make them low enough that they're not accepted. And then they can kind of say, well, we tried, and now we've hired this person. And they don't say, and that was the one we wanted all along. So this guy kind of figured that this was happening and was offered this low ball offer. And he kind of laughing, and he told me he accepted it. And I was like, well, why would you? He says, well, I thought it was, a good place to work. And I knew that they weren't expecting me to accept, but once I did, they had no choice because it's a legal offer and they couldn't take it back. And so I got the job because they offered, the position. I accepted. That was it. And then he said, I worked there at this low salary for a year. And I can't remember, the dean might have changed, and a new dean comes in, and this professor goes to the new dean and says, this is what I'm being paid. I don't think it's fair. And the dean looks at all the salaries in the school and says, yeah, that's crazy low. We're going to have to do something about that. And that was how he, fixed his problem and got what he wanted. So this slide is on integrative negotiation tactics. That's the win-win. I think it's straightforward. It's you have to have trust. You want to enlarge the pie if you can. And people do have a bias for fixed pie thinking. I was told a little story about kids and pies you might find amusing. You have two kids and you've got an amount of pie, not the whole pie obviously, but you've got this amount, and they fight all the time over who got which piece of pie. And you as the parent, you're trying to cut it exactly even, but they're still fighting, So you cut out the chunk of pie that you're willing to give these two kids, and you put it in front of them, and then you say to them, and there's this statement. So you can pause if you want. There's this trick that has been invented, life hack for this little situation. Okay, so here it is. The parent says, okay, one of you cuts and one of you chooses. That's how it's going to go. Fixed pie. One makes the cut. The other one gets to decide which piece of the pie. So, and then they can't complain, One person did the cutting, one person did the choosing. Integrative win-win requires creativity. It's worth the effort when it's important, when it really matters. And then we have the 5 tactics that a person like you can use in a win-win situation, and those are covered in the next few slides. The copious information exchange idea is that you have to start talking to build trust and to share knowledge, but you don't want to because you're afraid you'll give away too much, that you'll give the other side an advantage. So it does take skill, but you have to learn to be prepared to give this information out. And it says give away some non-critical information at the start to get the ball rolling, which means to get this sharing of information going. Someone has to start. There's a whole bunch of studies in psychology on negotiating and conflict. And the main finding is that what's called tit for tat is a really successful method. And tit for tat means when you're supposed to start with a positive. I will I will do something positive in this negotiation at the start, give a little, and then you're expected to give a little. And if you give a little, I'll give a little more. And then it goes back and forth until we reach an agreement. But if you give a little at the start and the other person does not give a little, you respond with a punishment. So tit for tat means I start off positive, but after that, I always do what you do. So I start positive, you give a positive, I give a positive. I start positive, you give a negative, I give a negative. You give another negative, I give another negative. And whatever they do after the first round, you're giving something positive. You always do what they do. It's very, very simple. And when I read in the newspaper about tariff wars or, between countries, it's essentially, it's just this model. Canada puts a tariff on U.S. exports of, something. The U.S. retaliates with a tariff on something that Canada's exporting. And then Canada retaliates. And, back and forth until they both agree, hey, this is just not helping anybody. Let's work this out. And then they start taking tariffs off. Okay, I'll take this one off. Okay, I'll take that one off. Okay, I'll take this one off. And maybe they end up signing a free trade agreement. And then somebody breaches it. It's like, okay, well, then I'm going to punish you for that. It just works. So you've got to have lots of information exchange. Framing differences as opportunities. We are different. We want different things, but that means we can find something unique in our situation where we can both win. We can both get something we want. Tell me what you want and I'll tell you what I want, and recognizing those things are different. But we might find some place we can explore. If you're buying, appliances at a store and they offer free delivery, so you could say, that you've built that in to your sales model, but I don't need free delivery. I'm willing to pick it up. What about that? How much will you take off the price if I'm willing to do that? So my example of delivery costs might actually be a cutting costs example. Lessen the cost for the other person, and maybe you can get a piece of that. Increasing resources. If we both want a larger office, but we're beside each other, so when the wall moves, one gets a smaller office, one gets a larger one, maybe we can find a way to both move to some other building where there are bigger offices. I don't know, I'm making this up. And superordinate goals we saw before in the groups and teams chapter. What is it we both want that's bigger than this particular discussion we're having now that we can focus on to make us both more willing to come to a win-win solution? What's important about this slide is the first bullet point, that there's 3 categories of stress reaction: behavioral, psychological, and physiological. So these are real, that people under stress change their behavior. They change how they act at work. And then the second category, psychological. Stress at work has direct effects on how a person feels about their job, about the organization, about their coworkers. It has these real effects on their cognitive decisions about what's happening. And physiological, that's their body. And stress has direct effects on a person's body. Some of those accumulate over time and are hard to notice. And of course, some people have bodies that are stronger and therefore they don't feel the same reaction to the same stress. But there are reactions a body has to stress that shouldn't be ignored. And there might be people out there that haven't felt much stress and therefore have not had much stress reaction in their life so far. And so it is important as a manager of others to realize that these three things are in fact real. That stress, when it's too much, will change how people act. And at the bottom we've got absenteeism. That's one reaction to stress, is to avoid it, to be absent, which is a bad thing from the organization's point of view. And another real reaction is their psychology changes, how they experience work. And then the third, again, that their body can have the effects of stress. Their blood pressure can change. They can get damage, of course, to their body, their skin, or other organs. That there are real physiological effects on people. And as a manager, once you realize these three things are real, then even if you haven't experienced them, that it can help you to work with other people. Next three slides are on those moderators of how personality moderates the perception of the stressor, the feeling of the stress, and also moderates, given that there has been a stress, the stress reaction. We talked about locus of control, or at least I did already, and the next two slides coming up, as you can see, are type A behavior as a personality pattern and negative affectivity. Well, the textbook authors have given us negative affectivity as a personality variable. Remember, affect is how you feel about something, and negative affectivity means everything's bad. You know, propensity to view the world in a negative light. Everything's bad. And the idea that this is a personality variable. You, in part, were born this way, remember, and in part, you were socialized and grew up to become this. And whatever the contributing percentages are, whether it's 50-50, not really central to this argument. There are people that this is how they deal with the world because of who they are. They're negative. So they're pessimistic, they're downbeat, meaning, they're negative at work. They feel more stress. They perceive more stress. They're sensitive to the stressors in the world. And also, interestingly, towards the bottom here, they tend to gravitate to stressful jobs. Right? It's interesting that your personality drives you to what is not good for you. And then they tend to provoke stress in others because they create conflict at work. And other people don't like to be around them. And some people react negatively to this negative affectivity. And so this person lives in a world that's got more stress than it has to have and that other people have. And here's what I think about it. I think this negative affectivity person I think they think everyone lives in this world. That everyone lives in a high stress, bad place. And it's not true, right? Some people live in the world is nice. And the last bullet point on the slide, this type of person, they don't deal with real sources of the stress that affects them. They're too passive, they're too indirect. They might deal with some of the symptoms, and so they don't lessen the stress that they feel. You might see this in others that work for you, and you might have to recommend them to counseling, psychological counseling, which is good. You should do that. Or you might try to help them yourself a little bit. Without being a psychologist, you can talk to people normally about what's bothering you and what can I fix for you as your manager. Like, you don't like the lighting in your office, it's too bright for your eyes, it hurts your eyes, you get headaches. Okay, we'll get a multi-spectrum light, we'll get a light with a rheostat, a dimmable light, we'll get different light bulbs. We can fix that physical problem. So things like that, I think you can do. Well, I won't say too much more here, but role overload, when you have too many tasks, I think managers like a lot of tasks. And they like a heavy and protracted, which means extended, continuing workload. And I think that's why they chose to be a manager. But it can be too much sometimes. You can ask for stress and then get too much of it back. And the conflict between your role at work, which you might be doing great at, but you're also a spouse or a parent, and maybe you're not putting as much into that role as others expect or need for satisfactory outcomes. And so that can be a problem, that kind of a role conflict or overload, just too much to do. We talked about job design earlier and how you can build jobs that are more motivating, but sometimes organizations don't do that. And sometimes people in poorly designed jobs have to work under conditions that are more stressful than they need to be. Maybe they're too simple. I once visited a factory in Edmonton that made plastic buckets, and it also made metal, those 30-gallon or 50-gallon drums. But anyway, plastic buckets. And there was a machine that was big. It was like 30 feet long, and plastic pellets came into the top from a chute. And the internal workings, I don't know, but it heated up the plastic, and it injected molded, I think, into a form, which was a 5-gallon plastic bucket. And there was a place where this machine would spit out this bucket. And it was like every 16 seconds a bucket was made. Well, a human had to be there to pick up this warm plastic with gloves on and turn around and place the bucket upside down on a wooden circular form. And there was a rotating table that had 8 of these wooden forms. And the bucket would cool over a few minutes. And as the buckets came around on this turntable, the cool bucket would be stacked into each other on the floor. They would later go over to the paint shop. And the hot bucket would be put on the next open form. And the worker would come in and take over from the work, because this machine would work continually, except for a servicing that happened like on Sundays for a few hours. But otherwise, this machine was working 24 hours a day. And so one worker would be doing the buckets, and then when their shift was up, the next worker's waiting, and it's like, okay, have a good day. And you step up, and 15 seconds later, the next bucket comes out, and that's your start of your shift. So you might do that for, let's say, 8 hours, 3 people, each working 8-hour shifts. And that's the job design. And they got paid well, but is it a good job to have? Well, I asked the manager because I looked at this job and I said, wow, like I could not do this job. It's just like too boring. And he said, yeah, I understand. Some people are like that. We hire some people and they're attracted by the pay and we put them in this job and maybe they last one shift. And sometimes they can't even last a shift and someone else has to jump in and help out. But he said there are people who love this, and they wear their headphones and they're listening to music, and they like it. And when the shift is done, they're done. There's nothing to think about. So that's job design, pro and con. But that was a simple job, and you might find you have people working for you who are doing that job because they have to. They need the money. This is the only job they can get, or the best job that pays the most that they can get, because you're paying for their boredom. And it's hurting them psychologically. It's stressing them and physically. So you need to notice that. So this slide is giving you the text information on boundary role stressors. That's a particular job that has its own stresses. And if you're ever asked in an organization to be the person that goes between two groups, that's a boundary role. And you can expect these kinds of stresses. Or you're dealing with the public, anything outside. And to be aware of that. And then this is the slide that transitions us into this idea of burnout. That accumulated stress over time can result in a particular outcome. I'm sure you've heard the term burnout before, and it's used casually just with regular people. But here we're talking about 3 particular phenomena that together make up what's called a syndrome. Emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and a sense of low self-efficacy. And the cynicism, when it's also called or symptomatic of depersonalization of others, seeing the other clients usually that you work with as not really people, as well, they're not people. They've been depersonalized. So you have a word for those clients that's not showing them as people. So in a hospital, for example, a care worker who's burning out or burned out might refer to a patient as the broken leg in room 4. So you can see that's depersonalized, the patient. That's not, the name of that actual person. It's just the symptom or the problem they have. Teachers who don't see their students as particular, each one an individual, but as a category. And attach some kind of a bad name. So let's imagine somebody who works at a movie theater in the snack bar who's burned out, right? They're emotionally exhausted. I'll describe that. They have this depersonalization of others, and they have a sense of low self-efficacy. So they're burned out. And their term for clients is popcorn munchers. I just made that up. So they're working there, and they're with colleagues there, and And as these patrons come into the theater, they're kind of muttering under their breath, oh, here comes some more popcorn munchers. And I'll bet they'll ask for extra butter too. And it's like, these are real people who've paid money to come to have an experience at your theater, and that's not what we want. So we don't want this kind of burnout. Emotional exhaustion, I'm here to tell you, is when you feel like you simply can't go on if the slightest thing happens. You feel fragile. If you've never felt this, I want to tell you that it's real, that other people do feel this. It may happen to you someday, of course, we hope it doesn't. But it's real. You are carrying on. This person with burnout, they are doing their work, but they just feel like the slightest thing and they'll break. Like a thin eggshell surrounds them, and the slightest tap on it and will shatter. And like Humpty Dumpty, fell off the wall, broke into all these pieces. That's what emotional exhaustion feels like. Cynicism, depersonalizing others. Low self-efficacy. That means they have this sense of they're not contributing the way they thought they could or would. That they're not making a difference. There's no impact. So burnout often happens with boundary spanners and people who deal with external clients, helping professions. So anyone who's a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer who deals with people more, so like divorce law, family law, very susceptible to burnout. Dentists, of course. Anyone who helps people or deals with them on a regular basis is more susceptible to burnout. More emotional labor, more stress. Stress accumulates, eventually leads to this syndrome, or can lead to this syndrome. Especially, there's a fifth bullet point down, people who entered their jobs with high ideals of the difference they were going to make, a social worker or a police officer, that they want to help people. That's why they got into that job. Veterinarian, want to help animals, love animals. Vets can burn out because they see so much pain and so many problems, and pets at the end of life, that their job is to help the pet at the end of life. So it can be hard. So high ideals can lead to more burnout, because these people came in with wanting to make so much of a difference, and then gradually somehow they've come to feel that they're not accomplishing that benefit that they wanted to make. Gender and personality are related to how much a person might feel burnout. And I wanted to also tell you that as a manager, I think your job is to notice the burnout of others and help them. And in high schools, think back to when you were in a high school. Were you ever in a situation where the fellow students tried to make a teacher cry? I can remember that in my high school, and maybe it still happens. And I don't really blame the children, because they're typically not adults in high school, and therefore they don't think like adults. They don't have the cognitive capacity. But I blame the other teachers and the administrators, the vice principals, the principal, department heads. I think it's their job to notice that a teacher is crying in class or is feeling these symptoms of burnout. Well, can they help themselves? And my take is that they can't. So I like to compare burnout to hypothermia. And hypothermia is where your body gets cold. And here in Alberta, typically if you're out in the winter and there's a cool wind blowing, but not a brutally cold wind, and you're shoveling snow and you're exerting a lot, maybe you're sweating, and that cool wind is hitting your sweat and cooling your body. You can get so cold that you can't think anymore. You can't think effectively because your body simply, your brain doesn't have the blood flow it needs, because your body, when it recognizes this is happening, it pulls the blood into the core and away from the extremities, which includes the brain. You can't think effectively. So I'm using hypothermia as a metaphor to tell you that the person with hypothermia, if you look up online, the answer is going to be like, what do you do? And I'm pretty sure it's going to say, help them. Help them. Get them out of the cold. Get the wet clothes, that are still cooling them, get them changed into something that's not wet. And I think you're supposed to warm them up gradually. The point is they have to be helped because they can't help themselves. And I think burnout's like that someone who is burning out or who has burned out has to actively be helped, and that's your job. So please, I'm asking you, when you see this in the future or now, please help that person. So get them help. To say to a person who's burned out, you need to see someone. You need to see a psychologist. You need to see a doctor, whatever. That's not enough. You have to actively take them by the hand and, make the appointment, take them to the appointment, explain to the doctor before the appointment, this is what I see. I'm a concerned person here. I work with this person. I'm this person's boss, manager. I take this as my responsibility. I'm not trained to help them beyond this. I need you to help them. Or call your company human resource department. But not just call and say, well, that's it. I've done my job. No, you have to follow up. Make sure they've been helped. So that's my request for you. What happens when someone's burned out? Here it says they sometimes become part of the legion of dead wood, which is scary. Legion, which means lots of dead wood. Doing little to contribute, poor performance, excessive absenteeism, all kinds of bad things. Sometimes people who are in contact-facing jobs with clients seek administrative careers to get away from the clients. So for teachers in school who find this pattern and want to get away from students, becoming an administrator might be a way out. Some people quit and they just can't deal with the public or the occupation they chose with high ideals to be a social worker, a police officer, that just can't do it anymore and leave. We have 2 slides on the job demands resources model and work engagement. And they define work engagement as a positive work-related state of mind, that it's characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption. And I note in the bullet point above that 79% of the workforce is either highly engaged or moderately engaged, presumably according to that definition. Well, vigor is high levels of energy and mental resilience at work. Dedication is being strongly involved in your work and experiencing a sense of significance, enthusiasm, and challenge. And absorption refers to being fully concentrated on and engrossed in your work. If 79% of the people are moderately and highly engaged to those levels, I think we're doing fine. Here's the second slide of that model. Job demands are physical, psychological, social, or organizational features of a job that require, and I think this is the important part, sustained physical or psychological effort that can in turn result in physiological or psychological costs. So when we're asking a lot of people in a sustained manner, then there's heavy demands on them, which can lead to negative outcomes unless job resources are provided to mitigate that. Job resources come from the organization, social relations, how the work is organized to make it clear, and the task itself. So when you're asking a lot of your people, it's important to also provide the resources they need to do the job, but also to take care of themselves. We have a professor at the University of Alberta School of Business, Dr. Michelle Innes, who studies workplace bullying. The repeated negative behavior directed toward an individual, typically of lower power or status, so they can't fight back. It's more difficult to fight back. And that therefore makes a hostile work environment. And that, of course, has downstream effects on stress, feelings of negative well-being, and then becoming sick and absent. An essential feature is its persistence, the repeated teasing, criticism, and undermining that is a feature of bullying in the workplace. This slide describes mobbing, when a group of workers gang up on one particular worker, so there's a lack of social support available to that bullied worker. And when the bullying person is the supervisor, it becomes abusive supervision. And some people quit not their job, but their supervisor or their manager. And it notes on this slide that this bullying behavior can be learned, and a culture of abuse can be created. If upper level managers bully their supervisors, then supervisors must target someone else to bully, which is lower in power, and so it will trickle down. There's a displacement issue that came up before, that if you're angry at how your manager's treating you and you're a supervisor, you can't attack up, so you attack down. This slide on sexual harassment and stress notes at the bottom bullet point, it is especially likely to be an issue when there's a climate or a culture that's tolerant of sexual harassment in the workplace, and that has been noted to occur more in traditional male-dominated jobs in male-dominated workplaces or industries. And this, of course, is a serious issue that leads to stress and stress reactions that have to be dealt with by not only the individual, but by the management and the organization as a whole. We definitely want to be careful about cyberbullying as a manager, noticing it, paying attention to evidence that it might be happening, and from your own point of view, making sure that your own electronic exchanges couldn't be misinterpreted. It's quite easy as the manager, someone higher in a hierarchy, to have their emails read in a different way than they were intended because of the power differential. So typically an upper level person has to be especially polite in order for it not to feel like demands and orders when you're asking for something. And also to make sure that you're not sending emails in the middle of the night, which could be interpreted by someone as a demand to act, when they get the email, whereas you just thought of something and happened to be awake getting a glass of water and you just sent off a quick email. So use the time delay function on your email settings so that you can send it during work hours. Anyone that has a family is well aware of conflicts between work and family responsibilities and roles. If you don't yet have a family and you intend to one day, then this is like a heads up that this is an issue that will arise with more people working, almost everyone working these days, people living longer, meaning that there's parents that are older that will require more care eventually, people who are very engaged in their work, which tends to be professionals, therefore they feel highly connected. It's important work. They'll feel more conflict because they want to do their work, but they also have these demands outside of work. And it also mentions that men and women are equally susceptible to feeling work-family conflict. Men may be less stressed by it if they can distance themselves from it, not feel that they have to act on it, or perhaps they have a partner that they can rely on to take care of those family responsibilities. These are straightforward. The job insecurity and changes in the work environment are stressful events because people don't know what it means for moving among job responsibilities. Perhaps some people will lose their jobs, be laid off, be fired, downsizing, right-sizing, artificial intelligence replacing workers with machines, even knowledge workers, mergers and acquisitions, because typically one of the appeals of a merger or acquisition is to gain efficiencies, and that normally means by reducing headcount, because people typically form about 75% of the costs of a business, except of course heavy capital-intensive businesses. And role ambiguity, when you don't know what you're being asked to do, or you're getting different messages from different supervisors, managers, it creates this uncertainty, which typically leads to felt stress. This one's interesting, how technology has led to stress in the workplace. The bottom bullet point says we react differently. Some people take advantage of technology and maybe go on a short vacation but still keep in touch with work so that they keep all the juggling, the balls in the air kind of thing. And so therefore technology can be helpful to some people, whereas other people, it says here, are more like separators. They would like to have a clean break between work and a vacation, and therefore don't take their cell phone with them, if that's even possible, which I don't think it is. And then the 5 dimensions to techno stress. Techno overload. We're too connected, too much information. We're on all the time. Techno invasion. There's no separation between work and non-work. Work expects us to be available. You might have a work cell phone that you have to carry, as well as you might have, of course, your personal cell phone. Techno uncertainty, the rate of change of technology, always a new version, having to upgrade, update, a new program that everyone else is using that you have to now learn. The complexity of that and the insecurity that possibly others, especially younger people, are better at technology and making you feel less capable, less competent, too old because of technology. This is an important slide. the three main reactions to stress. Behavioral, how people act. That's the next few slides. Psychological, how they think, how they feel, what's happening in their mind, their sense of self, anything like that. And that's coming up later. And then physiological, their body. And we dealt with that with type A. We talked about some of those reactions in your body. Heart problems, high blood pressure, cholesterol, rapid pulse rate, more likely to have diseases, lower immune function. So there will often be problems in a person's body when they have stress over a long period of time, especially, and higher levels of stress. We have a few slides now on behavioral reactions to stress, and we're starting with problem solving on this slide, and then we'll be looking at each of the others as they come up. That towards the bottom here, seeking social support, performance changes, and so on. So problem solving, we've kind of talked about this. This is what we recommend. Delegation, time management, talking with people, asking for help. That's a really good idea if you can. As I said before, people who are burned out find it difficult to ask for help because they're not thinking properly. They just don't know how. It's not that they necessarily don't want to ask for help or they don't want that help. Their cognitive function has declined. They just can't. And it's important for you to recognize that. If you say to someone, do you need some help? And they just sort of, they're like the metaphor, they're hypothermic, they can't think. So sometimes you just have to step in. And searching for alternatives, always good. So these are the good problem solving responses to stress that we recommend. Well, you need social support to deal with stressors at work, and that means you have to know people and be friends with people and have connections that you've developed over time so that they care about you and are willing to help you. And that's what the evidence finds. People with more support will do better with the stresses they face. And when that support is at work, it's even better because those people understand your situation. So, imagine a police officer who comes home and talks about or is feeling stress, and the spouse says, what's wrong? And the police officer doesn't feel that they can talk about these things that happened at work because they can be difficult, and the spouse may get scared that the police officer's spouse might, get hurt or die at work because of these difficult situations, and that could make it even worse. So the police officer doesn't say anything, and so can't get help at home. So that happens. And if you have other police officers you can talk to that are helpful as opposed to just saying, deal with it, then that's a way to get through these events in your officer life that are difficult. Well, performance changes. Under stress, performance can go up. We talked earlier, this U-shaped curve, that some stress is a good thing. It drives your performance up to its peak, but there's a point at which more stress degrades performance. When a person's under stress, their performance can drop off, and when it's too much. And the bottom bullet point under performance changes here mentions that it's the organizational citizenship behaviors that will drop off first because they're more discretionary. They're not measured as much. You can say no. you can shut your door, you can kind of hide out in a sense, and so that's kind of the first indicator that a person might be under stress. They're not helping like they used to. Well, this idea of presenteeism is interesting. It's absenteeism. We know we typically don't want. We want people at work. We want them to take their holidays, but we want them at work when they're supposed to be at work. But we don't want people at work when they're not well. You know, when someone has a cold and it's communicable, we typically don't want them to come to work because then other people can catch the cold and the whole office's performance can be affected. So you want them to take their sick day, but sometimes people feel they can't, and they're ill and they feel they must come to work because they only get paid, for example, if they're at work. So that's presenteeism. The person shouldn't be there, but they are there. And sometimes it's because of stress that they're burning out or maybe even burned out, and they still come to work, but they're not actually accomplishing much, if anything, or they're doing work that's harming the organization. And you'd rather they sought treatment and got better and weren't at work, but they feel they must come to work. This is the last of the behavioral reactions to stress listed in the textbook: addictive substances, notably smoking, drinking, and drug use. And they fail to terminate stress episodes. They don't solve anything. They're masking the problem. And people do engage in these behaviors because it's easier than dealing with the problem. And problems, remember, from another person's point of view, their problems are intractable. They're difficult. And if they could solve them easily, they would have. And smoking, drinking, and drug use to some extent allows you to escape a reality and enter into an alternate reality for a little while. But, third bullet point down, it hurts your physical ability to function and your mental ability to do your job. So, obviously not recommended. How do people react in their minds to stresses they feel? And one answer is defense mechanisms. And as it says here, they concentrate on anxiety reduction rather than on confronting the behavior, dealing with the stress, or solving the problem. So they're not helpful. And we have 5 that come from psychology, which I don't think you have to know like what each of these 5 is. I don't think that's the point. The point is that psychologists have said when people are under threat, under stress, they can react in these different ways in their minds to make the world in their mind a little different, easier to deal with. Rationalization, it's okay. The fact I'm not sleeping at night, more than an hour, that's okay. I'm strong, I can do that. A person might say something like that. Projection, seeing it in others. Displacement, talked about that idea of you feel stressed with maybe a supervisor, so you can't show anger at work, you show anger at home. Reaction formation, you show that your mind turns it into the opposite. And compensation. You feel inadequate in one area, so you try to feel extra competent in some other area so that it balances out in your mind. But it hasn't changed the fact that at work, for example, you're not feeling competent and being extra competent playing your sport doesn't actually, it might balance out in your mind, but it doesn't balance out in the real world. What can an organization do to help people manage the stresses they feel? Remember, it's in the person. They're the one that feels this. And it's never good to say you shouldn't feel stressed. It's not that stressful. Like, their feelings are their feelings. If they're feeling it, it's real to them. Well, we have 4 categories: job redesign, human resource practices that are more family friendly, stress management programs, and work-life balance, fitness, and wellness programs. The latter 3 are coming up on the next slides. This slide is just job redesign. Basically give people a little more control. People feel less stress when they have more ability to decide what they do, when they do it, the context in which they do it, more autonomy, to the extent that that's possible. Sometimes it's not possible, but we're only asking you as a manager to do what can be done, and maybe to think creatively about what can be done. And that it mentions here, stressful job designs often emerge from heavy-handed downsizings, letting people, cutting half of a team and saying we can't afford this anymore, and the other half is being asked to do the entire work of the team. This happens to nurses, I think, where there's a team of nurses and one or two get sick or can't come in to work, and the others don't get extra help. They're just asked, carry on, do the work. Job restructurings, heavy-handed, and mergers where you're asked to do some job you haven't done before, for example. I think we can generally agree these family-friendly human resource policies that we see on the slide are a good idea. They are expensive, but that's, the idea is that your human resources, your people, are your main asset. Again, aside from some industries that are heavily capital intensive as opposed to human capital. But there's the 4th bullet point down is interesting. A common problem is convincing people to use these resources. For example, mental health resources. You contract with a psychology service to provide counseling, and you give your employees the number and the website, and it's completely anonymous, it's completely confidential. Please use this service when you feel you need it. We need you healthy. But people don't want to because they feel a coworker might find out, someone might see them there, the word might get around, and they feel like that might threaten their job, that they might get laid off. People feel that. And that could be one reason they don't use these resources that you've provided. So your job as a manager is to help them actually use these resources so they can stay healthy and keep doing the job you hired them to do. Well, the bottom bullet point here says that these stress management techniques can help, but their effects are modest. And I think it's going to vary by the individual. It always does. So for some people, these might work a lot, and other people maybe not so much. So on average, maybe it's modest improvements. But it's worth a try. Meditation. You can get apps on your phone that will help you meditate, and you can put in like how many minutes you want, and at night before when you're ready to go to sleep, you can do, maybe you've decided you have 10 minutes and you can put into your app, I want a 10-minute meditation, and you'll get that. And the idea is that calms your mind and your breathing gets more regular and your muscles more relaxed. And then when you lie down to go to sleep, your mind's not racing with all these things that are happening at work, and therefore you can get to sleep earlier and therefore you sleep better, and your brain and your rest of your body, but definitely your brain, needs all these different REM cycles or cycles of sleep, one of which is REM, rapid eye movement. And there's these different sleep cycles, and you've got to have all of them for your body to be healthy. So that's the idea of meditation. And mindfulness training is next slide. Muscle relaxation exercises. Again, you might know some of these. You lie in bed when you're ready to go to sleep, and you tense your feet, and then you tense your calves, and then you tense your quads, and then you tense your glutes, and then you tense your abdominals, and then you tense, and you work your way up and tense and relax. And the idea is you've relaxed your whole body. Biofeedback training, I've seen videos of that where you hook up like a blood pressure monitor on your arm, a continuous one, and you watch a hot air balloon, and by thinking about the balloon coming down, your blood pressure can actually go down. I've seen it on video that it works. I've never seen it live. Time management training and positivity training. So worth a try, right? Could have put yoga in here too, I think, because it's definitely got all of this mixed in. Mindfulness is what the first bullet point says, popular topic, and people are thinking about mindfulness, staying in the present. And there is a famous author, there's a quote, I worried about many things in my life, most of which never happened. Something like that. I forget who it was. But the idea is, focus on the present. Focus on what's happening like right now. And don't worry. Don't worry about what could happen. Because lots of bad things can happen. But, they usually don't. So that's the base idea of mindfulness. This is our last slide in the stress material, that organizations actively think about their employees' health and wellness, and that they know that their people have to be healthy in mind and body in order to perform that the organization needs them to do, and therefore it's worth some investment from the organization in the health and work-life balance of their people. So they invest in these programs and provide facilities and encourage people to take advantage of these, and that is going to be a positive investment return in the long run. And people will feel less stress because of engaging in some of these activities.